Here is the full story of the light cruiser USS Helena, CL-50, from her build and combats to her tragic sinking in World War II, and finally her discovery many decades later. Construction and early service. Helena was a St. Louis-class light cruiser of the U.S. Navy, commissioned in September 1939. USS Helena, a 10,000-ton St. Louis-class light cruiser built at the New York Navy Yard, was commissioned in September 1939. After serving in the Atlantic in 1939–40, she was transferred to the Pacific, where she spent the rest of a short, eventful career. While tied up alongside 1010 Dock at the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, Helena was hit by a single torpedo during the Japanese raid of 7 December 1941, flooding an engine room and boiler room. Repair and modification work at the Pearl Harbor and Mare Island Navy Yards lasted through June 1942. In the summer of 1942, Helena was sent to the South Pacific, where she participated actively in the Guadalcanal campaign. She rescued survivors of USS Wasp CV-7 when that carrier was sunk by an enemy submarine on 15 September 1942. Twice in the 11–12 October Battle of Cape Esperance and the 13 November 1942 Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, Helena engaged in night surface combat, making important contributions to thwarting Japanese bombardments of vital Henderson Field. In January 1943, late in the Guadalcanal campaign, she twice shelled Japanese bases on New Georgia and Kolombangara Islands. Following a quick overhaul in Sydney, Australia, Helena returned to the combat zone in March 1943. She again bombarded enemy positions before and during the invasion of New Georgia and Rendezvous. In the early morning of 6 July 1943, Helena was part of a task force that fought Japanese destroyers in the Battle of Kula Gulf. Hit by 3 torpedoes in that action, the cruiser was broken into 3 parts and sunk, with the loss of nearly 170 of her crewmen. Displacement about 10,000 tons. Design. Length around 600+ feet. As Helena was moored inboard of Oglala along 1010 Dock, both ships were initially mistaken by Hiryu pilots to be one large battleship, rather than 2 separate smaller vessels, and were thusly attacked. Passing underneath Oglala, a torpedo impacted Helena's starboard side amidships. The resulting explosion damaged Helena, but the concussion damaged Oglala far worse. Although several other Hiryu pilots dropped on Helena, she only suffered the one initial hit, and her gunners threw up a tremendous volume of AA fire throughout the attack. Helena was lost on the evening of July 6, 1943, in the Battle of Kula Gulf. She entered service just as global tensions were rising, soon to be swept into the Pacific War. Attack at Pearl Harbor, 7th December 1941. Ship's data. Name: Helena. Hull number: CL-50. Dimensions: displacement: 9,700 tons. Design: full load: 13,000 tons. Waterline length: 600 feet. Length overall: 608 feet. Maximum beam: 61 feet 5 inches. Maximum draft: 20 feet. Armament: 15x6 47 cal triple mountings. 8x5 38 cal dual mountings. 8x.50 cal machine guns single mountings. Machinery: engines, Westinghouse geared turbines. Boilers: 8 Babcock & Wilkins. Horsepower: 100,000 shp. Speed: 32.5 knots. Protection: side belt, 1.5 inch to 5 inch. Decks: 3 inches. Turrets: 3 inches to 5 inches. Conning tower: 8 inches. Aircraft: 4. Complement: 868 normal, 1200 wartime. Photo gallery. Personal account from survivor. Port view. Starboard view aft. Close-up of superstructure. Starboard quarter docked. Underway, port quarter. Starboard view, underway. Close-up of forward turrets. Aft close-up during refit. Amidships details. Starboard view. A torpedo passed under Oglala and struck Helena amidships on her starboard side, damaging her engine and boiler rooms, but she survived the attack and was repaired. Map and information provided by Scott Fred Industries. Helena was in the berth normally occupied by the Pacific Fleet flagship Pennsylvania when the Japanese arrived on Sunday morning, 7 December 1941. A single aerial torpedo passed under the mine layer Oglala, which was moored alongside, and hit Helena amidships on her starboard side. Watertight integrity was quickly achieved by the ship's crew, and her enthusiastic anti-aircraft fire discouraged enemy airmen from attacking the cruiser again at close range. Partially repaired at Pearl, Helena steamed to San Francisco for permanent repair and overhaul. Captured Japanese newsreel of a torpedo plane taking off to attack Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The USS Helena CL-50 was hit by a torpedo from a plane like this. Picture provided by Charlie McClelland. Off Guadalcanal on 15 September 1942, Helena's crew helped rescue survivors of carrier Wasp, which was sunk by submarine torpedoes. 4 weeks later, the cruiser exacted vengeance for earlier wounds by pouring 6-inch shells into cruiser Furutaka and destroyer Fubuki. Both were sunk in this action, and other enemy warships in the 11-12 October Battle of Cape Esperance. See Salt Lake City for details of battle. And 4 weeks after Cape Esperance, Helena was one of 13 American warships that fought in the 13 November naval battle of Guadalcanal. It was one of 4 that was still operational the following day. In the early months of 1943, the cruiser was primarily occupied with shore bombardments in the New Georgia area. On 5 July 1943, she began her last operation by escorting transports to landings on New Georgia and by providing covering fire. Challenged by the enemy on the night of 6 July in what history remembers as the Battle of Kula Gulf, Helena turned her guns toward the 10 Japanese destroyers. Of the 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers in the American force, Helena became the favorite target for aim for Japanese torpedoes because she lacked flashless powder. Honolulu and St. Louis did not have flashless powder for their salvos, and the American destroyers initially held fire trying to set up a torpedo launch. Believed by the Japanese to be firing 6-inch machine guns, Helena blazed away and contributed to the sinking of enemy destroyer Nizuki before the first of 3 Japanese torpedoes exploded against her hull. The first torpedo hit below No. 1 turret and sheared off the bow of the cruiser. The next 2 torpedoes hit under the second stack. In only a few minutes, the cruiser jackknifed and sank. Most of the cruiser's survivors were picked up before morning, but many were not saved until 11 days later. Some of those not rescued on the 6th clustered around the slowly sinking bow, made land, and were rescued the following day. A larger group, considerably aided by lifeboats and life jackets dropped from a Navy plane and by 2 coast watchers and natives of Vela Velella, was picked up by destroyers on 17 July after several harrowing days in the water and on the enemy-held island. 168 men of the great ship did not survive the battle or the abandonment. Many of the survivors, like those of cruisers lost earlier, were reassigned to new cruisers. Over 400 of Helena's crew went to the new Houston, CL-81, and battleships. Helena's fighting spirit lived on. Of the 10 American cruisers lost in World War II, Helena was the last until Indianapolis was lost only days before the end of the war. This early survival set the tone for Helena's aggressive combat service. Combat in the Solomons and Guadalcanal campaign. After repairs, Helena was assigned to the South Pacific, playing major roles in the Solomons campaign, including the fight for Guadalcanal. Ship history.
Built at the New York Navy Yard in Brooklyn, New York. Laid down December 9, 1936 as a Brooklyn-class light cruiser. Launched August 27, 1939 as USS Helena CL-50 for Helena, Montana. Commissioned September 18, 1939 in the USN. Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, moored at Pearl Harbor in a berth normally assigned to USS Pennsylvania BB-38. During the first wave of the Japanese surprise attack, a B-5N1 Kate torpedo bomber from Suryu released a torpedo that hit her on the starboard side in the engine room. Quick damage control efforts saved the ship from further damage. Afterwards, repaired and overhauled at Mare Island. Returning to combat, Helena escorted a detachment of Naval Construction Battalion Seabees and an aircraft carrier from Espiritu Santo northward to Guadalcanal. On September 12, 1942, she helped rescue survivors of USS Wasp CV-7 after the aircraft carrier was torpedoed. Afterwards, escorted transports bound for Guadalcanal. On October 7, 1942, assigned to Task Force 64, Task Force 64 formed around USS Salt Lake City CA-25, USS Boise CL-47, USS Helena CL-50, and USS San Francisco CA-38 at Espiritu Santo, then departs for Guadalcanal to intercept Japanese Tokyo Express runs bound for Guadalcanal.
On October 11, 1942, at 11:35 p.m., Helena, equipped with SG radar, was first to contact the enemy and first to open fire at 11:46 p.m., at the start of the Battle of Cape Esperance, Second Battle of Savo Island. Gunfire from Helena sank heavy cruiser Furutaka and destroyer Fubuki. Afterwards, assigned to Task Force 64 under the command of Rear Admiral Willis Lee with battleship USS Washington, USS San Francisco, and USS Atalanta with 6 destroyers. During the night of October 20, 1942, while patrolling between Espiritu Santo and San Cristobal, a Japanese submarine fired several torpedoes at Helena that exploded nearby but was not hit. On October 25, 1942, participated in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, but saw no action, and afterwards returns to Guadalcanal. On November 4, 1942, Helena, USS San Francisco, and USS Sterett provide fire support against Japanese forces on Coley Point. Next, reassigned to Task Force 67.4 under the command of Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callahan as part of the support group to provide close support for transports bound for Guadalcanal. The force includes heavy cruisers USS San Francisco and USS Portland, light cruisers USS Atalanta, USS Helena, and USS Juno CL-52, with destroyers USS Cushing DD-376, USS Laffey DD-459, USS Sterett DD-407, USS O'Bannon DD-450, USS Aaron Ward DD-483, USS Barton DD-599, USS Monson DD-436, and USS Fletcher DD-445. On November 11, 1942, escorted transports to Guadalcanal. Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. On November 12, 1942, in the afternoon, Japanese artillery opened fire on the transports, and Helena and destroyers returned fire until a Japanese air raid commenced. During an 8-minute air raid by G4M1 Bettys, each armed with a torpedo, escorted by A6M20s, the force maneuvered as anti-aircraft fire broke up the first attack. The second wave damaged 2 ships, but Helena was undamaged. The force claimed 8 planes shot down. On November 13, 1942, in the early morning, the first phase of the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal began with the American force in a single-column formation, with the destroyers in the lead, with the cruisers in the center. At 1:24 a.m., Helena's SG radar detected the Japanese force under the command of Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe, but the report was not communicated in time due to radio trouble and confusion. Minutes later, both forces spotted each other at roughly the same moment visually. The Japanese warships were surprised, and their guns loaded for the shore bombardment, but decided to proceed. Meanwhile, Americans' orders to attempt a cross-the-T maneuver, but the Japanese force was scattered in several groups, and orders were delayed as the U.S. line began to fall apart. The two forces began to overlap as they waited for permission to open fire. During the battle, Helena received only minor damage from 5 hits to her superstructure that caused negligible damage and killed 1 sailor. At the end of the confused action, one of Helena's 40mm guns fired at cruiser Nagara, passing in the opposite direction as her guns fired at the retreating Japanese warships. When the 38-minute action ended at 2:26 a.m., the American force withdrew to the southeast as the Japanese withdrew in the opposite direction. On January 1, 1943, as part of Task Force 67, Helena was part of the covering force for 7 transports that landing the U.S. Army 25th Infantry Division on Guadalcanal. New Georgia bombardment. On January 4, 1943, Helena, USS St. Louis, and USS Nashville, with 2 destroyers, detach as Task Force 67.2 under the command of Rear Admiral Walden L. Ainsworth to bombard Munda on New Georgia. On January 5, 1943, in the early morning, the force bombards Munda Airfield and Munda. Although the warships fire 4,000 shells, they causes little damage, then departs. By 9 a.m., the bombardment force returns to Guadalcanal and rejoins Task Force 67 and was subjected to a Japanese air raid. During this action, Helena becomes the first U.S. Navy ship to use Mk-32 proximity fuse shells in combat, shooting down a Japanese HE Type 99 carrier bomber D-3A Val with her second salvo. Afterwards, departs south to Espirito Santo to refuel and resupply. On January 22, 1943, departs Espirito Santo northward on a mission to bombard Villa Airfield on Colombangar Island. On January 23, 1943, in the early morning, Helena, Nashville, and 4 destroyers entered Kula Gulf and fired 3,500 shells, while a PBY Catalina provided aerial spotting support. The force withdrew into rainstorms, chased by Japanese float planes and bombers, firing radar-directed 5-inch gunfire at the attackers. On January 25, 1943, returns to Espirito Santo. Afterwards, continues to operate with Task Force 67 and performs patrols and escorts convoys bound for Guadalcanal. On January 29, 1943, during the Battle of Rennell Island, provides distant support but does not participate in the action. On February 11, 1943, roughly 200 nautical miles south of San Cristobal in the Coral Sea, OS-2 Kingfisher from VCS-9 from Helena spots Japanese submarine I-18 and escorting destroyers USS Fletcher and USS O'Bannon intercept. The submarine was sunk by 3 depth charge attacks by USS Fletcher. On February 28, 1942, arrives Sydney, then for an overhaul at Sutherland Dock in Cockatoo Island Dockyard. On March 26, 1943, departs Sydney and 4 days later arrives Espirito Santo and joins Task Force 68 under the command of Rear Admiral Walden L. Ainsworth and began training for operations off New Georgia. On May 12, 1943, departs to bombard Villa Airfield on Colombangar Island. On June 30, 1943, Task Force 68 was patrolling the northern end of the Coral Sea with St. Louis, Honolulu, and destroyers USS O'Bannon, DD-450, USS Nicholas, DD-449, USS Chevalier, and USS Strong. On July 1, 1943, The force is 300 nautical miles south of New Georgia. On July 3, 1943, arrives Tulagi and went to battle stations for an air raid that proved to be a false alarm. Northern Force, New Georgia. On July 4 at 3:47 p.m., departs Tulagi Harbor with USS Honolulu leading, followed by USS St. Louis and USS Helena, plus 4 destroyers, to escort transports of the Northern Landing Force bound for northern New Georgia. Before midnight, the force enters Kula Gulf.
On January 1, 1943, as part of Task Force 67, Helena was part of the covering force for 7 transports that landing the U.S. Army 25th Infantry Division on Guadalcanal. New Georgia bombardment. On January 4, 1943, Helen, USS St. Louis, and USS Nashville with 2 destroyers attach as Task Force 67.2, under the command of Rear Admiral Walden L. Ainsworth, to bombard Munda on New Georgia. On January 5, 1943, in the early morning, the force bombards Munda Airfield and Munda. Although the warships fire 4,000 shells, they cause little damage, then departs. By 9 a.m., the bombardment force returns to Guadalcanal and rejoins Task Force 67, and was subjected to a Japanese air raid. During this action, Helena becomes the first U.S. Navy ship to use Mark 32 proximity fuse VT fuse shells in combat, shooting down a Japanese Aichi Type 99 carrier bomber blank D3A Val with her second salvo. Afterwards, departs south to Espiritu Santo to refuel and resupply. On January 22, 1943, departs Espiritu Santo northward on a mission to bombard Vila Airfield on Columbangara Island. On January 23, 1943, in the early morning, Helena, Nashville, and 4 destroyers entered Kula Gulf and fired 3,500 shells, while a PBY Catalina provided aerial spotting support. The force withdrew into rainstorms chased by Japanese float planes and bombers, firing radar-directed 5-inch gunfire at the attackers. On January 25, 1943, returns to Espiritu Santo. Afterwards, continues to operate with Task Force 67 and performs patrols and escorts convoys bound for Guadalcanal. On January 29, 1943, during the Battle of Rennell Island, provides distant support but does not participate in the action. On February 11th, roughly 200 nautical miles south of San Cristobal in the Coral Sea, OS-2U Kingfisher from VCS-9 from Helena spots Japanese submarine I-18 and escorting destroyers USS Fletcher and USS O'Bannon DD-450 intercept. The submarine was sunk by 3 depth-charge attacks by USS Fletcher. On February 28, 1942, arrives Sydney, then for an overhaul at Sutherland Dock in Cockatoo Island Dockyard. On March 26, 1943, departs Sydney and 4 days later arrives Espiritu Santo and joins Task Force 68 under the command of Rear Admiral Walden L. Ainsworth and began training for operations off New Georgia. On May 12, 1943, departs to bombard Vila Airfield on Columbangara Island. On June 30, 1943, Task Force 68 was patrolling the northern end of the Coral Sea with St. Louis, Honolulu, and destroyers USS O'Bannon, DD-450, USS Nicholas, DD-449, USS Chevalier, and USS Strong. On July 1, 1943, the force is 300 nautical miles south of New Georgia. On July 3, 1943, arrives Tulagi and went to battle stations for an air raid that proved to be a false alarm.
Northern Force, New Georgia. On July 4, 1943, at 3:47 p.m., departs Tulagi Harbor with USS Honolulu, CL-48, leading followed by USS St. Louis, CL-49, and USS Helena, plus 4 destroyers to escort transports of the Northern Landing Force, NLF, bound for northern New Georgia. Before midnight, the force enters Kula Gulf. On July 5, 1943, at 12:26 a.m., USS Honolulu CL-48 begins a shore bombardment of Vila Airfield on Kolumbangara Island to support the landing, and shortly afterwards, Helena opened fire. After 14 minutes of bombardment, the force turned eastward to bombard the rice anchorage on New Georgia for 6 minutes, then departed with splashes from Japanese shore-based guns, but none scored any hits. Meanwhile, Japanese destroyers arrived and spotted the American warships from their gunfire, but decided to withdraw, with Niizuki launching 14 torpedoes with 1 hits and sinks USS Strong DD-467 from 11 nautical miles away in what is believed to be the longest successful torpedo shot in the history of naval warfare. During the 2 bombardments, Helena fired over 1,000 shells from her main batteries and secondary guns. After the warships departed for Tulagi, Helena's crew worked to repair the broken shell hoist for turret number 5 broke down, and propellant cases were repeatedly jamming turret number 2. Repairs were completed 5 hours later, and in the early afternoon returns to Tulagi to refuel. Soon after returning, the force was ordered to return to Kula Gulf to intercept Japanese destroyers spotted leaving Bougainville, bound for New Georgia. Ending refueling operations, the force got underway, joined by USS Jenkins as a replacement, with USS Chevalier replaced by USS Radford DD-446. Meanwhile, a larger Japanese force of 10 destroyers sortied, transporting troops and supplies. Battle of Kula Gulf. On July 6, 1943, at 1 a.m., the American force entered Kula Gulf, with poor visibility and cloud cover. Meanwhile, the Japanese destroyers had already arrived and were unloading on Kolumbangara Island. At 1:36 a.m., at the start of the Battle of Kula Gulf, the Americans detect the Japanese on radar and close in a line-ahead formation with destroyers USS Nicholas and USS O'Bannon DD-450 ahead of the cruisers off northwest New Georgia. At 1:57 a.m., the Americans opened fire with radar-directed gunfire, with Helena targeting the lead Japanese destroyer Niizuki that was hit and quickly sunk, then switched her fire to the next destroyer. Using smokeless power, Helena was illuminated by bright flashes every time she fired, having expended all flashless gunpowder the previous action on July 5, 1943. Meanwhile, Suzuki and Tanikaze each launched 8 torpedoes aimed at the American warships.
Sinking history. At 2:03 a.m., the American force was ordered to turn to the starboard to engage the second group of destroyers, but moments later, 3 Japanese torpedoes, fired by Suzukaze or Tanikaze, hit the port side of Helena, causing serious damage. The first torpedo hit 150 feet from the bow, roughly 5 feet below the waterline of the forward turret, and caused a major explosion and might have detonated a magazine and destroyed the number 1 gun turret and created a large hole in the hull and flooding. Despite the damage, the rear turrets continued to fire and was able to maintain 25 knots despite the increased drag and flooding. 2 minutes later, a second torpedo hit, followed shortly afterwards by a third torpedo hit. These were both lower in the hull, roughly 15 feet below the waterline, and broke the keel and caused flooding that disabled the forward engine room and boiler rooms and was immobilized and without electrical power. 2 minutes after the third torpedo hit, Cecil ordered the crew to abandon ship, but remained on the bridge to flash a distress signal to friendly forces, but was not observed due to the confusion of battle. Fates of the crew. Due to the confusion of the battle, the other U.S. warships were not aware Helena was missing until 2:30 a.m., when they disengaged and the cruiser did not responding to radio calls. Searching, USS Radford DD-446 spotted Helena on radar and saw her sinking with the bow pointing upward with survivors in the water. At 3:41 a.m., USS Radford DD-446 and USS Nicholas DD-449 began rescuing survivors but broke off when their radar detected approaching destroyers and broke off to engage Suzukaze and Tanikaze that had turned to the northeast to reload their torpedoes but did not engage and departed. At 4:15 a.m., rescue operations resumed until 6 a.m. when another destroyer, Mochizuki, was detected and delayed the rescue. To avoid being caught in daylight by Japanese aircraft, the destroyers were forced to withdraw towards Tulagi, but left 4 whaleboats to help ferry survivors to the north coast of New Georgia. In total, the destroyers rescued 735 survivors. Nicholas rescued 291, and USS Radford rescued 444. Afterwards, 2 other groups of survivors remained in Kula Gulf. The first group was led by Captain C.P. Cecil, Helena's commanding officer, organized a small flotilla of 3 motor whaleboats, each towing a life raft, carrying 88 men to a small island about 7 miles from Rice Anchorage, after a laborious all-day passage. On July 7, 1943, in the morning, this group was rescued by USS Gwynn DD-433 and USS Woodworth DD-460. The second group of nearly 200 clung to the upright bow of Helena as it slowly sank. In the morning, a PB-4Y-1 Liberator dropped life jackets and 4 lifeboats to the survivors. The wounded were placed aboard the lifeboats, while the able-bodied surrounded the boats and did their best to propel themselves toward nearby Kolombangara Island. But wind and current carried them further into enemy waters. Through the torturous day that followed, many of the wounded died.
American search planes missed them, and Kolombangara Island gradually faded away. Another night passed, and in the morning the island of Vella La Vella was nearby. By dawn, survivors in all 3 remaining boats made it ashore. 2 coast watchers and loyal natives cared for the survivors as best they could, and radioed news of them to Guadalcanal. The 166 sailors then took to the jungle to evade Japanese patrols. Surface vessels were chosen for the final rescue, including USS Nicholas, DD-449, and USS Radford, DD-446, augmented by USS Jenkins, DD-447, and USS O'Bannon, DD-450, set off, 15 July 1943, to sail further up the slot than ever before, screening the movement of 2 destroyer transports and 4 other destroyers. During the night of July 16, 1943, they rescued 165 Helena crew, plus 16 Chinese hiding on Vella La Vella. During the torpedo attack and sinking, 168 crew were killed and remain listed as missing in action MIA. As the cruiser sank into Kula Gulf, her bow remained afloat until at least noon, with the 50 visible above the surface, with roughly 30 to 40 survivors clinging to the bow, with other survivors in the sea, plus flotsam and jetsam from the sinking and the battle. Diary of James Clare Noland, July 6, 1943, Tuesday. Proceeding on, I spotted something sticking out of the water about 8 miles offshore of N.E. Kolombangara. It was about 20 feet of the bow of the light cruiser Helena, projecting vertically out of the water. It must have been floating, as the depth of that position was over 500 fathoms or 3,000 feet. An amazing example of watertight integrity. Perched on and clinging to the bow were about 30 to 40 black, oily figures who waved madly as I passed. The number 50 was just barely visible above the water, definitely identifying the ship as the Helena, 10,000-ton light cruiser, 614 feet in length, 100,000 horsepower, 32 knots, 15 6-inch guns, crew of 900 men. In the surrounding area, extending in a smear of oil, life rafts, timbers, powder bags, shell cases, and other debris for a distance of 10 miles to the northwest, were total of about 150 men, including those clinging to the Helena. Supposedly, about 650 had been rescued the night before. Blown far out of reach of these pitiful, oil-covered figures in the water were empty life rafts and a motor whaleboat in good condition. The worst thing was the fact that the wind of 12 knots was blowing survivors and life rafts toward the nearby shoreline of Kolombangara and 10,000 Japs. There is no doubt but that anyone reaching shore would be butchered. Remains recovered. In 2006, remains were discovered at Renunga Island with the dog tag of S-1C General Preston Douglas. During the middle of September 2006, a team from Joint POW MIA Accounting Command, JPAC, recovered his remains. On January 26, 2007, he was buried next to his sister. Awards.
Helena was the first ship to receive the Navy Unit Commendation for her role in 3 actions: the Battle of Cape Esperance, the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, and the Battle of Kula Gulf. Of the 10 American cruisers lost in World War II, Helena was the last to sink. The last was USS Indianapolis CA-35.
References: Naval History and Heritage Command, NHHC, Helena II, CL-50, 1939 to 1943. Naval History and Heritage Command, NHHC, National Museum of the U.S. Navy, USS Helena, CL-50. NavSource, USS Helena, CL-50. Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships, USS Helena, CL-50. S1C, General Preston Douglas. This Damn Navy, Diary of James Clare Noland, July 6, 1943, Tuesday. In the surrounding area, extending in a smear of oil, life rafts, timbers, powder bags, shell cases, and other debris, for a distance of 10 miles to the northwest, were a total of about 150 men, including those clinging to the Helena. Supposedly, about 650 had been rescued the night before. Blown far out of reach of these pitiful oil-covered figures in the water were empty life rafts and a motor whaleboat in good condition. The worst thing was the fact that the wind of 12 knots was blowing survivors and life rafts toward the nearby shoreline of Kolombangara and 10,000 Japs. There is no doubt but that anyone reaching shore would be butchered. I sent in a message to Comair Seoul advising immediate rescue by PBYs with fighter coverage to prevent any of the survivors being blown ashore into Jap hands. To my knowledge, no PBYs were ever sent. The Sextant, USS Helena, CL-50. Ready, Willing, and Valiant by Dave Werner, April 6, 2018. DVIDS, USS Helena, CL-50. Ready, Willing, and Valiant, April 6, 2018. YouTube. Wreckage of USS Helena discovered in New Georgia Sound, South Pacific, April 11, 2018. Contribute information. Are you a relative or associated with any person mentioned? Do you have photos or additional information to add?
She earned a reputation for her intense rate of fire with her 6-inch guns. In fact, the Japanese reportedly joked she must have 6-inch machine guns. Saga of Cruiser Helena, a great fighting ship. Used with permission of the Times-Union of Albany, New York. Copy of clippings donated by Eugene E. Lejeunesse, MMIC, USS Helena, CL-50, 1941 to 743. Albany Times-Union, Sunday, October 24, 1943. Navy releases the story of her brief, hell-roaring life. By Hamilton W. Farron. Washington, October 23, AP. She was one of the fightin' this men-o'-war that ever scoured the seas. With that accolade, the Navy today told the story of the brief, hell-roaring life of the cruiser Helena, sunk in the Battle of Kula Gulf. She proved her might in 13 fire-filled engagements in which she blasted, helped to destroy, or damaged 15 Japanese warships. The Japanese had given her an accolade too. In a propaganda broadcast, the Japanese reported the U.S. Navy had a new secret weapon, a 6-inch machine gun. But it wasn't a machine gun, it was the rapid fire of the Helena's gun crews. She was in Pearl Harbor when the Japanese struck on December 7, 1941. Her anti-aircraft batteries accounted for at least 6 enemy planes. The Helena was hit, but repairs were made promptly. She escorted the aircraft carrier Hornet. She was with the Wasp when that carrier was torpedoed September 15, 1942.
The Helena's first big engagement came shortly thereafter in the fight battle of Cape Esperance, where 4 Japanese destroyers, 4 cruisers, and a transport were sent down. Just 98 seconds after the battle was joined, the Helena's guns had fired and sunk a Japanese destroyer. Then her big guns swung on a cruiser. 4.5 minutes later, the cruiser went down. A Japanese cruiser and another U.S. cruiser were swapping punches. The Helena moved in, turned her batteries on the enemy, and the Japanese cruiser quickly went down. Then, an enemy destroyer sneaked in to fire a torpedo, but the Helena dodged. The destroyer tried to flee, too late. It had already been fired upon by another American ship. The Helena's guns finished the job.
Biggest day to come. The Helena's biggest day came later. Japanese shore batteries had opened fire on American transports unloading troops at Guadalcanal, and the Helena was ordered to silence them. She did. Then the Japanese sent in bomber and fighter planes. 9 enemy bombers were shot down by American fire, 4 of them officially credited to the Helena's anti-aircraft batteries. That night came the Battle of Guadalcanal, a desperate effort by the Japanese to regain control of the Solomons. They failed, turned back crushed and beaten. The Helena was the first to sight the enemy off Savo Island. She held her fire until she had steamed into the enemy fleet. Then, a Japanese searchlight found the Helena. Her main battery, first to fire in the battle, struck with a full salvo on the enemy cruiser from which the searchlight beamed. The enemy burst into flames, lighting the battle area, while American destroyers rushed in to loose their torpedoes. Fire was maintained on the Japanese cruiser. She went down. Main battery slowed down, but the secondary hammered a destroyer into the sea. 6 enemy ships sought to flee. The Helena chased them. One was a big cruiser which, it was learned later, had hurled the shells that tore the bridge from the San Francisco, killing Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callahan, task force commander, and other officers. The enemy cruiser was sunk. The Helena's secondary battery got another destroyer. Lighter guns poured shells into the bridge of another Japanese ship. Still another enemy ship, lined up in the fleeing force, was set afire. The secondary battery got another destroyer. The Japanese fleet scattered in confusion. Came the Battle of Kula Gulf on July 5th and 6th, when the Japanese lost 9 to 11 cruisers and destroyers. The United States lost 1, the Helena. When the action began, the Helena's main battery immediately sank an enemy ship. The secondary downed 2 destroyers in 1-2 order.
Enemy scores, both batteries then shifted to new targets and had badly damaged 2 more ships when an enemy destroyers closed in. Their torpedoes crashed into the Helena, and she went down 20 minutes later. Her men swam through the oil-covered water, floating on rafts. By the following morning, all but 166 of her survivors had been picked up. Those still in the water made their way to Vella La Vella. There, aided by friendly natives, they lived in a camp hidden under giant banyan trees. Japanese troops were on the island, and once a patrol approached close to the Helena's survivors, but natives disposed of the patrol. Finally, communication was established with U.S. naval forces on Tulagi Island. 10 ships made the rescue, steaming through uncharted waters, constantly menaced by Japanese shore batteries and enemy warships cruising nearby. Now, says the Navy, snatched from the sea and the steaming Jap-infested South Pacific jungle, nearly 1,000 men of the Helena today stand fit and ready to fight again.
Key engagements included the Battle of Cape Esperance, October 1942, and the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, November 1942. USS Helena, a 10,000-ton St. Louis-class light cruiser built at the New York Navy Yard, was commissioned in September 1939. After serving in the Atlantic in 1939–40, she was transferred to the Pacific, where she spent the rest of a short, eventful career. While tied up alongside 1010 Dock at the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, Helena was hit by a single torpedo during the Japanese raid of 7 December 1941, flooding an engine room and boiler room. Repair and modification work at the Pearl Harbor and Mare Island Navy Yards lasted through June 1942. In the summer of 1942, Helena was sent to the South Pacific, where she participated actively in the Guadalcanal campaign. She rescued survivors of USS Wasp CV-7 when that carrier was sunk by an enemy submarine on 15 September. Twice in the 11–12 October Battle of Cape Esperance and the 13 November 1942 Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, Helena engaged in night surface combat, making important contributions to thwarting Japanese bombardments of vital Henderson Field. In January 1943, late in the Guadalcanal campaign, she twice shelled Japanese bases on New Georgia and Kolumbangara Islands. Following a quick overhaul at Sydney, Australia, Helena returned to the combat zone in March 1943. She again bombarded enemy positions before and during the invasion of New Georgia and Rendova. In the early morning of 6 July 1943, Helena was part of a task force that fought Japanese destroyers in the Battle of Kula Gulf. Hit by 3 torpedoes in that action, the cruiser was broken into 3 parts and sunk, with a loss of nearly 170 of her crewmen.
Final mission and sinking at the Battle of Kula Gulf, July 1943. In early July 1943, Helena was supporting landings and bombardments around New Georgia and Kolumbangara. The Battle of Kula Gulf, USS Helena, CL-50. Just before midnight on July 4th, the Helena and destroyers escorting troop ships and supplies moved into Kula Gulf and bombarded the beach for the last time. The landing of troops was successful by dawn of July 5th. But during that battle, we lost the destroyer Strong to a Japanese submarine that laid for us. In the afternoon of July 5th, word came that the Tokyo Express was ready to roar down the slot. The maps of the Solomon Islands. 1. Kolumbangara Island, where Captain Cecil and others were rescued July 7, 1943. 2. Kula Gulf, where the CL-50 was sunk July 6, 1943. 3. Vela Vela Vela, where 165 officers and men were stranded, be rescued July 16, 1943. 4. Ranongo Island, where the remains of General Preston Douglas, S-1 SIC USS Helena CL-50 were found in 2006. 5. Blackett Strait, where John F. Kennedy's PT-109 was sunk August 2, 1943. 6. Rendova Island, PT-109's base. The information and map above provided by shipmate Charlie McClelland, USS Helena CL-50. On the evening of July 5, 1943, Helena joined up with the cruisers Honolulu and St. Louis and 4 destroyers.
Helena CL-50, foreground. St. Louis CL-49, middle. Honolulu CL-48, background. Battle of Kula Gulf. USN versus the Japs. We set off to take on 10 Japanese destroyers in Kula Gulf. The enemy destroyers were part of a reinforcement group which intended to land additional troops and supplies on Munda. We were part of Task Force 18, under the command of Rear Admiral Walden L. Ainsworth. I served with Admiral Ainsworth when he was the executive officer on the Mississippi many years earlier. Our battle group went to general quarters at midnight, and the Helena prepared for its 3rd major engagement with the Tokyo Express.
I had the 12 to 4 watch in the aft engine room as chief of the watch with the chief of engineering, Lieutenant Commander Cook. We were making 25 knots with all 8 boilers online. Our radar picked up a column of Japanese destroyers at 0140, and after our admiral put our ships into a battle formation, we commenced firing with our 6-inch guns. Our Captain Cecil went into rapid fire without zigzagging like our previous Captain Hoover. Our big guns were firing so rapidly that the Japanese thought that we were using some kind of secret 6-inch machine gun. This image is thought to be the last picture taken before she was sunk. The Last Battle of the USS Helena. Painting by Tom W. Freeman. Used with permission. William Henderson. While assisting the occupation in the Solomon Island campaign, the USS Helena was torpedoed and sunk off New Georgia Island in the early morning of 6 July, 1943. She was later awarded the Navy Unit Citation posthumously for gallantry in action during the Solomon Island campaign. To read the citation, click here. One big disadvantage for us was that we were using gunpowder that was not flashless. We were totally illuminated to the enemy and presented them with an easy target every time our guns fired, which was nearly continuously. The other cruisers had flashless powder. We had used all of ours up during the preceding day's bombardment. After 7 minutes of rapid fire in which our gunners fired more than 1,000 rounds, we sank 2 destroyers. I heard over the headphones, 2 down, 1 to go. Then we were hit up forward by a long lance torpedo, which blew off our bow and took our number 1 turret with it. One of the enemy destroyers had rapidly maneuvered within range of us and launched 4 torpedoes. All of our Black Gang shipmates in the forward engine room were killed. About 1 minute later, we were hit by a second torpedo. This knocked out all our lights and steam to the after engine room.
Chief Engineer Cook tried to get communication with the bridge. After we had tried every JV phone and no one responded, he gave the order to open the steel hatch so we could get out of the engine room. We all got out of the engine room and tried to close the watertight hatch, but the air pressure escaping from the engine room kept us from closing it tight. Then the 3rd torpedo hit right under us, and water hit us all and sent us flying in all directions. The ship's back was broken, and we knew that we didn't have much time to get up on deck. Seawater was rushing in so fast that we couldn't close the engine room hatch. The only light we had was from weak flashlights and battle lanterns, which only made our situation even more frightening. A torrential stream of water followed us as we struggled to get to the upper decks. We barely cleared the next compartment. The intense water pressure knocked me from the port side to the starboard side and then back again to the middle. That compartment filled up quickly, and we were all trying to get out through an 18-inch hole called a scuttle. By the time I got to the ladder, the water was about 3 feet from the ceiling, and 1 person was ahead of me on the ladder. Someone on the deck above us tried to close the hatch on us, but we twisted the wheel out of their hands. By then, I was getting desperate, and as soon as the hatch was open, I helped the guy ahead of me with a good boost. It was one of our junior officers climbing too slowly, so I pushed him through the hole with as much force as I could, one of the few times in my career that I had a chance to push an officer around. The water was only a foot or 2 from the overhead when I cleared the compartment. The next day, after we were rescued, I was talking to Lieutenant David LaHue, our junior division officer, and he said, "Some son of a hit me in the ass and knocked me clean through that scuttle." I'd admitted that it was me, and I was in a hurry. We both got a good laugh.
The rescue. I got to topside and lay on the quarterdeck for about 10 minutes, watching the firing going on from the other remaining ships. Then all was quiet. The night was very dark. Not even the stars were showing. The ship started cracking up forward, and someone said, "We better get some of these rafts in the water." That's when we all realized that the ship was going down. Then I realized that I had no life jacket. I left it in the engine room. A second-class machinist mate, George Schoolman, said, "That's all right, Kleps. We can hold hands and go over the side together." So we held hands and jumped. Of course, our hands were separated on impact with the water. But we both managed to get on the same raft. As soon as we did, the brass 6-inch powder cases began to fall off the ship and onto our raft. We had no choice but to abandon that raft. I wanted to get as far as I could from the ship so as not to get caught in the suction when it sank. We could see the stern of the ship slowly going down. Fortunately for us, there was almost no suction. I watched with a heavy heart as the ship, which had been my home for almost 4 years, the Happy Helena, disappeared beneath the Pacific. I just couldn't take my eyes off of it until it finally went below. Then I thought, I better get on a raft. So I was looking around for a raft, but they all floated away from me while I was so enthused with watching that ship go down. Then I knew I was in real danger of drowning. Being a good swimmer, I kicked off my shoes and began dog paddling. It seemed like I dog paddled for about an hour. I found myself alone in the dark of night in an oily sea. Once again, I realized that I was in danger of drowning as I grew tired. I was ready to give up and sucked in some water, but the oil made me gag and I spit it out. I made up my mind then and there that with God's help, I was going to survive. I really prayed in earnest for the good Lord to save me and kept dog paddling for about another hour. Then, like a miracle was happening, I heard voices in the distance. I swam over to the voices and found 4 life rafts that were tied together. My prayers had been answered. There were only 48 men on all 4 rafts. It seemed about 30 minutes, and we saw a destroyer approaching us in the dark. At first, all we could see was a silhouette, and we hoped that it was one of ours and not Japanese. Fortunately, it was one of ours, the Nicholas.
USS Nicholas, DD-449. They had the small 20mm guns trained on us, just in case we were the enemy. One of the seamen had a flashlight and signaled CL-50, our ship's number. They said they would be right back. They still had enemy ships in the area and were going to pursue it. They kept their word and returned in about a half hour and had thrown nets over the side to help us climb aboard. I had received quite a jar in my left knee when the 3rd torpedo went off under us and had to be helped to climb up the cargo net. My knee was much better in a few days. After boarding the destroyer Nicholas, I went below deck, all dripping wet and covered with fuel oil. Many years later, when writing this, while lying awake at night, it came to me that the good Lord was watching over me when I swam away from that first raft I was on. George Schoolman, the guy who held hands with me as we jumped overboard, ended up on a different raft. They floated 3 days in the hot sun before they reached an island. When I wrote to him over 50 years afterward, he told me what torture they went through in the rafts. They were almost blind from the sun and oil in their eyes from the ship. He never told me how many men died from exposure and bites from sharks. I was lucky to be picked up the same night by the destroyer Nicholas, or should I say, thank you, dear God, for watching over me. The men treated us royally, offering us dry clothes and even a cigarette to calm us down. Smoking is never allowed on a cruiser, but these gunners didn't seem to think anything of it, even while taking care of the guns. After being picked up, the Nicholas picked up a Japanese destroyer that was trying to sneak out of Kula Gulf. I went out on deck for fresh air just as the destroyer went to flank speed and began firing again. We were still in battle. Hot 5-inch shell casings were being flung out of the turrets and landing next to me. I found myself jumping back and forth trying to avoid the shell casings and the rotating turret. The noise and concussion was knocking me down. Talk about being between a rock and a hard place. I finally got below deck and out of the way. They launched 4 torpedoes and claimed to have gotten 3 hits on the enemy. Then they pumped about 55-inch shells into the Japanese ship. The destroyer Nicholas took us into a small harbor between Tulagi and Guadalcanal. We got to the harbor at Tulagi and began linking up with other survivors of the Helena. Of the 900 men who served on the Helena, 168 were lost. A large number of our shipmates had clung to the bow section of the ship when it floated to the surface from the ship's wreck, a miracle in itself. Life rafts were dropped to them by a rescue plane, and the men drifted for several days to the island of Vella Lavella. Others made their way to New Georgia and other scattered islands of the Kula Gulf. All the islands were occupied by the Japanese.
Friendly natives, missionaries, and coast watchers helped the survivors evade the Japanese and sheltered and fed the American sailors until they could be rescued. For those who didn't make it to the islands, death took them in the shark-infested sea as they groped along in the hot sun, while half-blind and sickened from the oil which had covered the water when the ship went down. On July 16, 1943, the last of the survivors were brought back. They had survived a 10-day ordeal. The Helena earned 7 battle stars and would be the first ship honored with a Navy unit commendation. We were finally able to clean up while ashore at Tulagi. The only thing which could get the oil off our skin was a new product, lava soap. More than a month later, at the Mare Island Navy Yard, I reported to sickbay with an earache. The corpsman relieved my discomfort by removing a large glob of oil which was lodged deep in my ear. Oil from Kula Gulf had gotten trapped in my ear, hardened, and became infected. Once the oil was removed, I was okay.